the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Panama, Cuba, and other places in the Caribbean, military intervention in Latin America has been a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. That policy became official back in 1823 when President James Monroe established the doctrine that bears his name. It took a more aggressive turn at the dawn of the 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt defined the U.S. role in the Western Hemisphere in the memorable phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Since then, American troops have brandished that stick on the soil of neighboring countries no less than 34 times. The most recent example, Haiti, in 1994.
The drums of war are beating, and even the generals here in Haiti can hear them now. No one doubts any longer that preparations are underway for a massive U.S. invasion to drive out Haiti's military rulers and restore the elected president.
The message of the United States to the Haitian dictators is clear. Your time is up.
President Clinton stood ready to use U.S. power to restore Haiti's elected president Jean-Bertrand Aristide. But at the last minute, Haiti's generals acquiesced to Aristide's return. American troops, nonetheless, landed in Haiti to make sure the deal stuck.
It was a peaceful invasion, but an invasion nonetheless. By week's end, nearly 15,000 American troops had occupied the independent, sovereign nation of Haiti. Yogi Berra would have called it déjà vu all over again. The United States, the Colossus to the north, had used its overwhelming military and political strength to intervene once again in the affairs of a Caribbean neighbor.
Déjà vu indeed. It was, after all, the 34th invasion of a Latin American country in this century. The pattern was set almost as soon as the U.S. built the Panama Canal in 1914.
Because the construction of the Panama Canal was such an enormous technological feat and a great economic investment, U.S. policy towards the whole Caribbean basin changed. Whereas we had been unconcerned about instability in the region in the 19th century, we became almost obsessed with instability after the construction of the canal.
To protect the canal and other U.S. interests in the area, no less than 5 different American presidents sent troops into Nicaragua and other Caribbean countries, where they became, in effect, armies of occupation.
From 1912 to 1933, the Marines occupied Nicaragua. They ran the banks, railroads, customs houses, and tax collections. That force also trained the Nicaraguan National Guard.
Nor was Nicaragua the exception. Other Caribbean countries were ruled by dictators who had risen to power with U.S. support. But Washington's hegemony over the region was suddenly shattered in 1959 when Cuba's Fulgencio Batista was overthrown by a new kind of dictator.
Now Batista has fled. A new leader is on the scene, Castro.
The first week of January 1959, Cuba would be changed forever. A liberator had come.
You come into Havana a conquering hero, like a Caesar.
It was a happy day for everybody, but it was the culmination of something that we had been working for.
Cuba libre.
But not for the United States, as it watched Castro emerge as a communist, ally himself with the Soviet Union, and lash out at what he called Yankee imperialism.
The United States was the owner of our electric power plants, of our telephone companies, of the main transportation companies, of the principal industries, of the best lands, of the largest sugar mills. They owned the Cuban economy.
But in the atmosphere of the Cold War, the U.S. was not ready to accept a communist as the leader of a country just 90 miles away. In March 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to overthrow Fidel Castro. But it was President Kennedy who turned policy into military action against Castro.
It was April 17, 1961. Brigade 2506, a group of 1,500 CIA-trained exiles, invaded Castro's Cuba along this beach. Without air cover and U.S. military backup, the Brigade of Exiles was trapped, and within 5 days, most of Brigade 2506 were Fidel Castro's prisoners.
America's failure at the Bay of Pigs was a foreign policy disaster, and that convinced the bearded Cuban leader the United States would seek revenge.
Castro believed then, and believes today, that the U.S. was planning to launch another full-scale invasion against Cuba.
And it was precisely that danger, the danger of a direct invasion by the American forces that led to the missile crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Russians fortified Cuba in 1962 with nuclear weapons capable of striking at the very heart of the United States, it triggered a near-catastrophic showdown between the two superpowers. The threat of a global conflagration did not end until Soviet Premier Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles. But a communist government remained in Cuba, and 3 years later there were fears in Washington that the virus had spread to a nearby nation, the Dominican Republic.
What began as a popular democratic revolution that was committed to democracy and social justice moved into the hands of a band of communist conspirators.
To crush that conspiracy, President Lyndon Johnson sent 42,000 U.S. troops to the Dominican Republic.
The Marines are moving out. They're firing. They're engaged in actual combat with Dominican rebel snipers. No longer is this a purely protective operation. This is battle. Americans are firing against Dominicans, and Dominicans are firing against Americans.
At the year's end, tranquility has not yet been restored. Sporadic fighting still goes on, and the Dominican experience has left a legacy of bitterness.
In 1979, Fidel Castro's so-called virus of Marxism seemed to have found a home in Nicaragua when the left-leaning Sandinista rebels came to power there. And that same year, an obscure Marxist party toppled an eccentric dictator on the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada. President Ronald Reagan viewed these developments as clear signs that communism was again on the rise in America's backyard. And like Kennedy and Johnson before him, he was determined to do something about it.
Must we just accept the destabilization of an entire region from the Panama Canal to Mexico on our southern border? Must we sit by while independent nations of this hemisphere are integrated into the most aggressive empire the modern world has seen?
In a 1983 speech to a joint session of Congress, President Reagan sounded the alarm about presumed Soviet influence in Central America. And he went on to warn that communist influence had spread to yet another country in the Caribbean.
On the small island of Grenada, at the southern end of the Caribbean chain, the Cubans, with Soviet financing and backing, are in the process of building an airfield with a 10,000-foot runway. Grenada doesn't even have an air force. Who is it intended for?
Grenada's Prime Minister Maurice Bishop denied that the new airport would aid his Russian and Cuban allies.
Over and over again, we have given assurances on this, and so far as we are concerned, this airport is for strictly civilian and commercial purposes.
At the time of this statement in June 1983, Bishop was in the U.S. trying to improve relations with the Reagan administration. He was rebuffed, and once back in Grenada, Bishop paid dearly for his attempt at reconciliation.
The leftist military is in control of Grenada this morning. The Prime Minister of the Caribbean island nation, Maurice Bishop, was shot to death last night by soldiers in the People's Revolutionary Army. So were 3 of his cabinet ministers in a showdown at Army headquarters. A round-the-clock curfew is in effect now.
Anyone who seeks to demonstrate or disturb the peace will be shot.
People were just chopping down from that fort with the guns going off, you know.
At first, 10 people were reported killed in the bloody coup. But months later, a mass grave yielded more than 100 victims. In the U.S., though, the immediate concern was the safety of a colony of Americans on the island.
There is an American-run medical school in Grenada, and most of the 800 to 1,000 Americans on the island are either students or faculty there. A school official based in this country who's been in constant contact with the school says all the Americans are believed safe.
Really, we're quite shocked that there was this type of bloodshed
but it has not spilled over into the streets in general, and it certainly is not anywhere near the campus where most of the Americans who live on the island are residing now.
Whether or not they ever faced real danger, Reagan wanted the option of being able to go to their aid.
Pentagon sources say a U.S. Navy task force, including 2,000 Marines, is heading south toward the Caribbean. The ships and Marines left their East Coast ports earlier this week bound for Lebanon, but were given a change of orders out of concern for the safety of the 1,100 Americans on the island of Grenada.
That was intended to be only a watchdog mission, but then the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States requested direct U.S. intervention in Grenada. The Reagan White House was giving that request serious consideration when, on October 23, 1983, Washington was rocked by news of a military disaster in the Middle East.
A catastrophic terrorist explosion has killed many United States Marines in Lebanon. A terrorist drove a truck full of explosives up to a 4-story building of battalion headquarters at Beirut Airport, where about 150 or 200 Marines were sleeping, and detonated the explosives. An officer at the scene said, "I haven't seen such carnage since Vietnam."
As the administration coped with the death of 241 Marines in Beirut, the fate of the Americans in Grenada assumed new urgency. The president briefed congressional leaders and gave thumbs up for Operation Urgent Fury, which sent 15,000 troops into Grenada.
We have taken this decisive action for 3 reasons. First, and overriding importance, to protect innocent lives, including up to 1,000 Americans whose personal safety is, of course, my paramount concern. Second, to forestall further chaos. And third, to assist in the restoration of conditions of law and order and of governmental institutions to the island of Grenada.
The battle for Grenada officially began at 5 o'clock Tuesday morning when 400 Marines landed by helicopter at Pearls Airport on the island's east coast. The fighting was light, no Marine casualties. The real battle began a half hour later when 200 Army Rangers parachuted from 500 feet onto the airstrip at Point Salinas. On the ground, American soldiers came under small arms fire, some of it coming from Cubans.
Some Democrats on Capitol Hill were quick to criticize the operation.
This is an act of war and raises genuine questions about whether it is a violation of the Charter of the United Nations, a violation of the Charter of the Organization of American States.
Gunboat diplomacy has a new king. Move over, Teddy Roosevelt.
And since the invasion was launched less than 48 hours after the Beirut bombing, it raised suspicions about the administration's motives.
It's almost like the United States is trying to find one that they can win. We weren't in Lebanon, we weren't in Central America, so off we go against Grenada.
But what was actually happening in Grenada was anyone's guess, because reporters were banned from covering the first 2 days of the military action. For their safety, said the Defense Department. As a result, the press corps had to rely on official announcements that the mission in Grenada was a success.
Just handed a note, Mr. Secretary, saying that the rescue of the students at the Grand Aunts campus of the medical college is underway, and 6 helicopter loads of students, 6 headed back.
Some kissed the ground, some wept, some shouted with joy, and the basic message was the same. It's good to be back in the good old USA. That's the reaction of the students rescued from Grenada, and everyone interviewed agreed they were in danger.
We felt like we were in quite a bit of danger, actually, because there was fire all around us. We could hear helicopters and anti-aircraft guns and machine guns. We didn't know what the heck was going on. We didn't know whose fire was what at this point.
When they broke through our door, they kicked it open and they said, "The American soldiers are here." And we just let out a loud cheer. We were so happy.
3 days after the invasion began, members of the press were finally allowed into Grenada. And by then, most of the fighting was over.
Resistance on Grenada today had all but ceased, and by tonight, American forces had captured the leaders of the coup that triggered the invasion. Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Cord taken yesterday, and a man claiming to be General Hudson Austin today. The Pentagon now puts the U.S. casualty toll at 16 dead, 77 wounded, and 3 missing.
All the administration's proclaimed objectives have been accomplished this past week. American medical students are safe. An unpopular Marxist government has been overthrown. Cuba has lost an ally. Officers here say it worked, this invasion. Because of numbers, that's all. A task force of 15,000 to take an island of less than 110,000 residents. If a larger force has ever been assembled for a smaller objective, no one here can remember when that might have been.
On the surface, at least, there was no doubt that the brief Grenada campaign was a military success. But once it was over, the questions began, especially about the medical students. Had they really been in as much danger as the Reagan White House claimed?
They were actually thanking President Reagan for saving them after the intervention occurred, for helping them out of a terrible warlike situation that occurred as a result of the intervention. The truth, however, was that prior to the intervention, the students and their parents had petitioned the administration not to intervene, saying that they were safe and secure, and that an intervention might very well create a terrible problem for them, as in fact it did.
But the hurried intervention also created a problem for the U.S. military. Because of the rush to invade, U.S. troops did not possess detailed intelligence about the island. That lack of intelligence may have exposed the troops to unnecessary risks and may have contributed to the deaths of the 19 Americans killed in Grenada.
Is it the case that we had no intelligence resources on the ground in Grenada?
Yes, it is. It was a startling admission by National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane. Until the third week of October, Grenada was a low-priority intelligence target. We're told that at the most, 2 agents were on the island at any one time. One intelligence official said there were more important places for our resources than this pipsqueak island. By contrast, 7 months ago, President Reagan made Grenada sound like an area of immediate concern.
It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. We got there just in time.
I've been told by people involved in that invasion that when our troops landed, they had no idea where they were or where they were supposed to go. They had very poor intelligence. They had to go to gasoline stations and ask for maps of the island.
The missteps may have contributed to a series of mistakes that led to numerous casualties, both military and civilian.
The Pentagon now acknowledges at least 12 persons killed when a Navy jet attacked a hospital in the capital of St. George's. The attack came on the first day of the invasion. A team of SEALs, the Navy's elite commando unit, was trapped while trying to rescue the island's Governor-General, Sir Paul Scoon, from his home. Artillery fire was coming from the direction of the hospital, so the Americans called in an airstrike. At the time, the Pentagon says, no one knew it was a hospital.
In fact, confusion, haste, and poor intelligence may have led to most of the U.S. casualties.
Pentagon officials also say most of the 18 American deaths during the invasion of the island resulted from accidents. 4 members of the Navy's elite SEALs commando unit drowned in a pre-invasion accident. The Washington Post this morning reports several Army Rangers were killed and others wounded in a collision of 2 helicopters.
In addition, invading U.S. troops had no idea what kind of resistance they would encounter once they landed.
The Cubans surprised Americans with heavy gunfire. The Americans came back with Navy jet fire, strafing the Cubans. Several dozen Cubans were killed and captured, and only then did they give up.
We didn't anticipate meeting Cuban fighting units. We knew there were Cuban construction workers in there who might have been reservists.
But the Cubans indicated the fighting could have been avoided altogether.
The Cuban interest section in Washington released excerpts from cables allegedly sent from Havana to Grenada. Their message, had the U.S. concerned itself only with the safety of its citizens, there would have been no fighting between Americans and Cubans. A cable purportedly sent by Fidel Castro on the Saturday before the invasion directs the Cubans on the island to fire only if fired upon and not to interfere with attempts to evacuate American students.
But once the shooting started, Castro ordered his 700-plus troops on Grenada to fight to the end.
Last night, at a midnight news conference, Cuban President Fidel Castro was asked why he had not sent reinforcements to Grenada.
It was impossible because the U.S. squadron and aircraft carriers were moving that direction. We had no transportation means.
Castro called the United States invasion of Grenada an unjustifiable error that would create resentment against the U.S.
Almost forgotten in all the confusion was Ronald Reagan's original concern when he first warned the American people about the communist buildup in Grenada under then Prime Minister Maurice Bishop.
Remember the airport controversy in Grenada? Bishop, along with the Cubans, was building a new international airport that he said could handle those big jumbo jets full of tourists. But President Reagan said the design and purpose were military. Well, here we are about a year later, and Grenada still doesn't have an air force, but this airport is being rushed to completion pretty much to the same scale as before. The major difference is this. Instead of Cuba doing most of the financing and supervising the construction, that's now being done by the United States. And America now says this airport is necessary for the growth of tourism here, which is what Grenada said all along.
Despite the irony of American taxpayers finishing an airport begun by Cuban communists, what Ronald Reagan had said all along did indeed come to pass.
Signs of the transformation, the Reagan counter-revolution, are everywhere, and not just in Grenada. The Second Fleet delivered a strong and simple message last year. It read, "America is carrying a big stick again and is prepared to use it." It's no accident that now, 1 year later, conservative governments, Ronald Reagan's friends in the Caribbean, are stronger than ever, and that left-wing movements are shattered and splintered.
1 year ago, we liberated Grenada from communist thugs who had taken over that country. It was a second American Revolution, and it's only just begun. America is back.
For years, Panama chafed under what it regarded as the heavy hand of the United States. So it was no surprise when Panamanians exploded in a burst of national pride in 1977 after their president, General Omar Torrijos, negotiated the return of the Panama Canal by the end of the 20th century. A national hero, Torrijos died tragically in a plane crash in 1981. His successor, General Manuel Noriega, was more controversial. In fact, Noriega's reputed trafficking in drugs had become so blatant by the late 1980s that the U.S. felt it could no longer stand idly by.
2 separate U.S. federal indictments reported tonight against Panama's military strongman, General Manuel Noriega. Criminal charges of cocaine trafficking and more.
Justice Department sources say the indictments charge that General Noriega virtually turned the government of Panama into a criminal enterprise and made millions from the Colombian drug cartel.
For his part, Noriega denied the charges.
General Noriega, have you yourself never profited from the transshipment of drugs from Colombia to Panama to the United States?
Nunca.
Never. Never.
Nunca.
Never. Question. How much do you make? What's your salary?
¿Cuál es tu salario?
Hard question. Simple question.
¿Difícil o sencillo? No, sencillo. Pero la pregunta.
You want time?
Break.
Look, you say break. It is my understanding that you make about $50,000 a year in your job. But you have several homes here in Panama, home in Paris, fabulous art collections. You are said to be worth $400 million. I don't know. Your supporters laugh at that. You're a very wealthy man. Where does all the money come from, General Noriega? Your money.
It's all false.
By 1989, the Bush administration was hoping that presidential elections that spring would give Panamanians a chance to reject Noriega's hand-picked candidates. The general had agreed to allow an international team in to monitor the election. But when Noriega began to have second thoughts, Robert Pastor was sent to Panama to confirm the agreement.
The negotiations I had with General Noriega were some of the most bizarre that I've ever had with a foreign leader. He was drunk. He was angry. At one moment in the negotiations, he jumped up on a table and began throwing things at me. I had to put up with all of that in order to try to secure just one objective. And that objective was to permit us to send in an international monitoring team led by former Presidents Carter and Ford. And he agreed to that.
The heavily monitored election encouraged a heavy turnout, and the Panamanian people voted against Noriega's candidate, or so it seemed.
The people won. We won. The Ado Civilista won by a vote of 70 or 75% of the voters.
There's no doubt the people voted overwhelmingly for democracy. Whether or not their votes will be counted accurately still remains to be seen.
2 days after the polls closed, the first results finally announced on national TV. General Noriega's candidate's winning by a margin of 2-1. There's nothing we can do about it because they have the guns, said this man.
Noriega's supporters made no attempt to conceal what they had done.
If the United States doesn't like our type of democracy, well, that's just too bad.
The official losers took to the streets on May 10th to protest Noriega's purported stealing of the election. Their protest quickly ran into angry resistance from Noriega loyalists.
The brutal attack came as the opposition candidates were leading a demonstration through the streets when they were confronted by this group of thugs. Their T-shirts read Dignity Battalion. They are, in effect, Noriega's militia. They break through, threatening violence. Shouting, "You're going to die here," they start swinging. Watch closely. At least a dozen of Panama's riot police are standing by, making no effort to interfere with the attacking mob. The most vicious attack, the beating and arrest of opposition candidate Billy Ford, was captured by cameras from around the world. Again, it is clear, Panamanian riot police are standing by, doing nothing to interfere with the attackers.
The attack infuriated George Bush, who was just 4 months into his presidency.
You cannot have an election that is blatantly stolen, where people that win are beaten up by thugs.
The president also called on Noriega's own soldiers to desert his cause.
I would love to see him get him out. We'd like to see him out of there.
To that end, the U.S. backed a coup against Noriega 5 months later, a coup that failed. Emboldened by that failure, Noriega stepped up his harassment of Americans in Panama, and that harassment sealed his fate.
U.S. officials are calling it the worst U.S.-Panamanian confrontation in 25 years. American soldiers are in battle gear tonight, guarding U.S. bases in Panama after one officer was killed last night and a second was wounded by General Manuel Noriega's troops.
According to the U.S. Southern Command, the American officer who died at Gorgas Military Hospital was shot when he tried to escape from an angry mob after he and others mistakenly strayed into the area near General Noriega's headquarters.
The latest round of confrontation comes on the heels of General Noriega's elevation to head of state by his hand-picked assembly, officially investing him with absolute powers. He declared that a state of war exists with the United States.
I think this pressure reached the point that President Bush found himself in a position where he could not but go ahead with an invasion. Otherwise, he would be embarrassed.